The CS1 solenoid assembly can be found mounted to the bottom of the body here. In order to access the solenoid assembly, you must first remove the grip frame. Please see the separate video on how to remove the frame. The solenoid assembly is made up of two main parts. We have the pilot valve here, and we have the spool assembly here. The spool assembly is what controls the flow of gas into the firing chamber and into and out of the bolt system. The pilot system here just drives this main spool assembly inside here. There's no reason ever to remove the pilot from the mounting plate here unless you need to remove the pilot. The spool, however, can be removed and re-lubricated as and when required. In order to gain access to the spool inside the main solenoid body here, you must first remove these 4 screws. You can use a 2mm or 5/64 driver in order to remove the 4 screws. Take them out one at a time. Once those 4 screws have been removed, simply lift the whole solenoid assembly away from the manifold underneath and remove the main solenoid spool body here. These parts can be placed to one side now while we take out the spool. There's a small pip on the back of the spool here. It can be used to grab hold of the spool, slide it out of the housing. Grab that and slide it out. There's nothing else inside this body, just the housing. Wipe off any grease from the spool. Take some fresh clipped grease, a very small amount, just enough to wet all the seals. And grease those 4 seals that are on the spool. Take hold of the spool, slide it back into the housing. Again, wipe off any dirt, debris and excess grease from the spool body. Place that to one side. Now take pilot section, the mounting plate for the pilot, reattach it onto the spool housing. Drop this assembly back onto the manifold, making sure that none of the wires are trapped between the manifold and the mounting plate or the spool body. Everything should be sat nicely in the grooves behind the retaining clips on both sides. Once everything is sat in place, you can reattach 4 screws. Do each one up very lightly to start with until all 4 screws are in place. None of these need to be tightened down very tight at all. Once they're all in place, work your way around all 4, gently snugging them into place. No need to over tighten any of them. Once that's been done, you can now reattach the frame and reassemble your marker. If you're going to disassemble the solenoid assembly further than just simply greasing the spool inside here, you'll first need to remove the wiring from behind the clips to allow access to the manifold, allow the manifold to be lifted off and the gaskets inspected. gently lift each of the wires out from behind the clips in the body. These should just pop out and allow all the wiring to sit away from the side of the manifold and the solenoid body. Do the same on both sides. Gently lift those out and unclip them from behind the wire guides and let them move away from the solenoid. With the wires moved away from the solenoid body, you can now remove the 4 mounting screws. And solenoid assembly can be lifted away. Just disconnect the spool assembly, the main body placed to one side. You can just leave the mounting plate and the pilot just to hang free at the side. You now have access to the manifold that sits underneath the main spool assembly. That can be lifted out. That lifted out, you can place to one side. What you can see here is the manifold assembly has 3 separate gaskets. The gasket at this end, gasket at this end, on the reverse there's another long gasket. As with any gaskets, make sure they're clean, they're not damaged, not scratched, not bent or peeled in any way, or have been trapped between the body and the manifold plate at any time. You have a very light application of grease, and the grease really is just there to hold them in place while you're assembling and disassembling. Again, make sure all 3 gaskets are sat nicely in their troughs inside the manifold plate. At this point, you're now ready to rebuild it. Take the body and drop the manifold into place, making sure it sits down nice and snug on the body and it shouldn't move around at all. You can now take pilot assembly, reattach it to the spool assembly, making sure there's no wires again trapped between the solenoid assembly and the manifold or the body. Drop the whole solenoid assembly back onto the body and four screws back into place. Just do them up very lightly, one at a time. Don't over tighten anything at this stage. Make sure they're all seated before you go around and tighten one by one. You can go around a couple of times just to make sure each one is snugged up, but don't apply any excessive torque onto any of these screws. Once all the screws are back in place and the manifold is in place, the solenoid is in place and the pilot is in place, take the wires and clip them back behind the wire tidies on either side of the manifold. Push the wires down behind the little clips. It'll hold them out of the way. Stop them getting trapped between the body and the frame. You can do that for the pilot valve wires and for the breech sensor wires. Before assembling the frame back on, just double check that everything is nice and tidy on both sides. Make sure that the wires where they run across the body to the interface board are tucked in towards the centre of the body, not overhanging the sides, then the frame can be reattached. As well as the manifold and the gasket sat underneath the manifold and on top of the manifold that clamp between the body and the solenoid assembly here, we also have two further solenoid gaskets mounted inside the frame. The large oval one here is the one that allows a gas transfer from the frame into the solenoid assembly, and you can see that sits in the large oval pocket here. Then you have the smaller gasket which seals the exhaust gas from the bolt through the frame and into the SFR assembly. While all this is disassembled, it's always advisable to check the condition of both of these gaskets, the key one being the one that seals the gas transfer from the frame into the solenoid assembly. Make sure there's no debris on it, no dirt, and it should be clean without any nicks, scratches or cuts in it. Always make sure they're both in good condition before reassembling the frame back onto the body.